Musky Factory.
Good evening and welcome everybody once again to week 12 of the Musky Monday seminar series. Imagine that, 12 down and 9 to go. If we get 21 of these in, that'll take us right up to the first day of the musky fishing season here in Eastern Ontario, where we can go out on the smaller bodies of water. A couple weeks after that on the Ottawa, but 21 episodes. Episode 12 this week. It's a big one. Pete Maina is our guest. Couldn't be happier to have Pete on the show. Pete is one of the big personalities in the musky world for the last 3 decades or more. He's done everything. He's been a TV host and a guest on so much television over the years. He's an author. He's a magazine editor. He's a tackle entrepreneur, and his name may be on more equipment than anyone else's name. A veteran educator, but mostly Pete is a massively good musky fisherman, a really experienced guide, and somebody that's just great to spend time with out on the boat. So we're going to explore Pete's musky journey today, from his obsession with catching the most muskies. Yeah, there was a standard, or there is a standard for catching the most muskies, and he's done that a bunch of times, to his all in all the time guide lifestyle to where he is today. So Pete will be on shortly. We're also going to talk COVID pressure with Pete. The first time I heard anybody use that word COVID pressure was Pete at a Hamilton chapter event a couple months ago. And it's a really interesting concept when you think about it. And absolutely, COVID's created some different kind of pressure on our muskies. We're going to talk about social media pressure on muskies. Yep, that's a real thing. Causes more handling. Let's talk about it. Pressured muskies, in case you didn't get that, we're going to talk about pressured muskies, spring tactics and considerations, and we'll talk about petechial hemorrhaging. This is a pet topic, a pet project for Pete. He's got some really great information related to petechial hemorrhaging and better handling of muskies. And that ties right into Dr. Sean and Ask the Biologist, which this week, Sean is going to answer the question, what's best for the muskies in terms of handling? And we'll talk petechial hemorrhaging. There's some new studies going on. I guess one in Virginia about warm water that'll be out soon. So we'll touch on a few different areas, review the latest science on handling. That goes well with something near and dear to Pete's heart, to my heart. And so we'll get there in a few minutes. The Musky Monday seminar series schedule. Next week, Jason Quintano on Lake St. Clair. I don't know if there's anybody that catches more muskies than Jason Quintano. I've been out with Jason a few times. He is the most technical troller I have ever been in a boat with. So if you want to learn everything trolling, Jason is the guy. Next week, March 29th, April 12th, Death of the St. Lawrence Musky Fishery Show. Yeah, it's a controversial title. It's meant to grab your attention and to wake you up and to tell you how for spawning success and for finding young of the year muskies has been on the upper and middle St. Lawrence for the last bunch of years. So it's time to stop watching this. It's time to take action on it. And this precedes the Muskies Canada Muskie Odyssey, and then the Muskie Trader Symposium, both research focused, and so much great learning opportunities coming at us in this month ahead. I got to say thank yous as always. So thanks to you, the listener. You drive our show. Your questions drive the topics that we have and the guests that we have on here. So keep them coming. Send in to Sean as usual. We pick your questions for his segment every week for Ask the Biologist. Thanks to my team, Mike Spratt, behind the scenes as usual, making baits as we speak, no doubt. Lisa Goodyear, our Martin Scorsese, our producer extraordinaire behind the scenes. Lisa, come on out and say hi.
Well, thanks for that.
Sure, you are. You make us look good, and it's flawless every week. And I keep emphasizing that word flawless because you're going to disappear tonight, aren't you, for a little while? You're in demand these days. Where are you going to go?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited actually. I got asked to go and talk Muskies on the Canadian Fishing Network live show tonight with the Yvonne Brown and Scotty Martin. So that should be fun.
Fantastic. So you're going to disappear for a little while, and people can tune into that tomorrow. Is that right?
Yeah, on the Canadian Fishing Network or CFN Facebook page, they can check it out.
Okay, that's got a lot of great people on that network, including Big Jim McLaughlin, who we're going to juggle his time on CFN for an evening and make sure that he does a great show with us on the history of muskie fishing around Ottawa and pass on some of his great knowledge. So thanks as usual for your flawless directorship. I'm sure your replacement will be just fine, and you can send him out now if you want. Hey, Mike Kadura.
You got this, Mike.
No pressure. Is Mike flipping the switches right now? Lisa's been flawless for 12 weeks. 12 weeks so far while we've done this. Mike, there he is. He's got the director's sunglasses on. He's in the director's chair. No problem at all, right?
Now it's working. It's Murphy's Law, but I got the director glasses on and I'm ready to go. No nervousness. Let's have a great show.
Okay, I'm so glad that you and Lisa make this work well behind the scenes. My rule is never touch anything on the computer, and then you don't have problems. So thanks for doing this, Mike. We'll talk to you in a little while.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thanks to Shimano, as always. 100 years of Shimano, a big part of my fishing life. Really proud to be on the Shimano team. To Andre Lalonde, Marine, Crestliner Boats, and Mercury. Andre's the best boat guy I've ever had. You can find him out in Wendover. You should be getting your boat ready now, thinking about that. Suick Tackle, happy to be on the Suick team. Chaos, happy to be on the Chaos team. Catch lots of baits on both of those lure products. Sail, Canada's outdoor superstore. Muskies Canada. We love Muskies Canada so much. We donate $2 from every bait that we sell at the Muskie Factory Bait Company directly to research. Sport fishing and research right here on the crest for Muskies Canada. So many good reasons to join Muskies Canada. The preeminent place to learn. April 17th and 18th coming up, the Canadian Muskie Odyssey. I think it's 16 separate seminars that you can take in over a weekend, access to all kinds of exclusive baits. The single greatest learning opportunity if you're a muskie fisherman happening in North America this year. Canadian Muskie Odyssey coming up at the end of April 30th and May 1st. The Muskie Trader guys are running their Muskie Trader Symposium and looking to raise big money for muskie research. So, so many reasons to support muskie research. Our episode again on the St. Lawrence, and you're going to hear more about the St. Lawrence at the Muskie Odyssey and at the Muskie Trader Symposium. So, need research now more than ever. And speaking of research, our favorite research biologist, our doctor in the house, Dr. Sean Landsman, here every week with Ask the Biologist, and he's in honor. That is some Pete Maina honor hair. Pete Maina or Bob Marley? I don't know. Where are you going?
I don't know. Yeah, you might. It depends who you ask. I don't have the curl, the epic curl that Pete has. I got some more wavy stuff going on here, but my wife likes it, so the boss likes it. It stays.
Yeah. Wow. Well, good looking hair, man. I used to have hair like that. I'm feeling sad, but go with it while you can. Go.
Right.
Never grow old and go with it while you can. You and Pete are both big advocates on handling, and a lot of your research has been about best practices for handling. So, tying in with a bunch of what Pete's going to say tonight, what are you going to tell us about best handling practices for our fish these days?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about kind of what we know about what the science has told us anyway about how to best handle these fish. I mean, you guys are going to talk a little bit about increased pressure as a result of social media, and COVID-19 has has certainly gotten a lot more people outside and introducing more people to the great outdoors, which is amazing. Also potentially problematic if we see increased mortality rates associated with lower survival rates post-release after people release their fish. So we'll talk, a little bit about some of the best practices and some of my other thoughts about things that I think we can improve upon as we move forward. And I talk a little bit about too what I see as being some upcoming potential issues relative to successful releases and muskie fishing. So kind of the future, sort of the next steps. So Mike, go ahead and you can throw out my presentation there. Here we go. I get some variation of this question kind of frequently. What's best for the fish? I got it. I think that was like verbatim, a question that was asked to me recently by one of the viewers of the show. And so I thought, one of the things that I admire about Pete is that he's been a staunch proponent of good handling practices for pretty much as long as I've been in the sport. And I started muskie fishing in 2003. I think that was my first, 2001, because I caught my first one 2 days before September 11th. So it's 2001. So since 2001, and before that even, Pete has been a big proponent of safe handling practices for muskies. So I want to kind of give a nod to Pete there and his passion, and hopefully Pete can help amplify some of the messaging from this presentation. But let's get into it here. As a group of anglers, musky anglers are among some of the most conservation-oriented anglers in all of recreational fishing, in my opinion. Rivaled only maybe by some trout fishermen. But musky anglers care really deeply for the fish they catch. And as a result of that, over the years, there have been quite a number of different refinements to handling procedures that anglers have developed. These refinements and modern day handling procedures really were what formed the basis for Project Noble Beast. And I just have to give a shout out to Muskies Canada folks and Muskies Inc. I'm a member of both organizations actually. They're just, as a scientist, when you're able to collaborate with people as passionate and interested in science and willing to help and really actively wanting to help, it's really refreshing. So certainly, Pete embodies a lot of that high passion that lots of people have. But when we're talking about muskie fishing as a sport, typically this sport and the fish that we catch, this is typified by really high release rates in this fishery, and particularly for specialized anglers. So typically we see over 95% of release rates for specialized anglers. It's going to be less for people that are more generalized anglers. There's different minimum length limits in Ontario. There's different minimum length limits throughout a lot of different individual states, and these are management agencies that are trying to provide different kinds of opportunities for anglers, be it the trophy fisheries or the more action oriented or harvest oriented fisheries. But generally speaking, specialized anglers tend to release a really high percentage of the fish that they catch, even legal sized ones, harvestable ones. So the high length limits that we see in a lot of lakes and rivers across North America, plus really high voluntary release rates, all of these things assume that we're successfully releasing the fish that we catch. And there was some question about that in the scientific community anyway, and that's what really provided the impetus for Project Noble Beast back over 10 years ago at this point. It's hard to imagine that was over 10 years ago, but in 2009. So that was really what provided the impetus for that project and for my master's. And We walked away having learned quite a bit. But for a lot of anglers themselves, really just served to confirm what the angling community had been saying for years. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about some of these things like knotless and coated nets. I mean, these are that's been one of the technological advancements that's been really great for our sport and for fish handling in general, is just to reduce the amount of injury and dermal injury, skin-related injuries, split fins, things like that. They're not perfect. I see Frabill and Beckman nets that still cause fin splits in fish, but the goal is to reduce the occurrence of that from happening, and those kinds of nets do that. We see really musky specific gear now. We've got 80-pound super braid, we've got 130-pound super braid, 174-pound single strand steel leaders, 130-pound fluorocarbon leaders, rods that are designed specifically. Jim Sarek talked about the skicks there that he helped design. These are rods that are designed specifically for muskies. Lots of backbone in them. They're intended to help get those fish in really quickly. And that's, another element to this whole ball game of ensuring a good release is making sure that you get that fish in quickly and don't dilly-dally with it on the line. And then, one of the things that has been shown to be extremely detrimental to good releases is JHooked live bait. I mean, that's such an antiquated method of fishing that, I don't know very many people that do it anymore. Certainly, probably no serious specialized musky anglers. Perhaps some of your more generalist anglers that want to go out and catch one in the fall every year, but otherwise don't have any interest in pursuing them. Yeah, definitely a big no-no there. No JHook live bait. That's real bad for the fish. So aside from JHooked live bait, what's the worst thing that we can do to the fish when we're handling them? And plainly put, and study after study, this is beyond muskies, across species, the very worst thing we can do is air exposure, is expose the fish to air. Just plainly put, as soon as you take a fish out of the water, they can't breathe anymore. There was a question in the comments last week about, how come fish can't breathe out of water? And that has to do with their gill lamellae collapsing, basically. And they go from having lots of surface area when the water is supporting all those gill filaments to now very little surface area, and you can't get the right oxygen exchange going over the gills, and they basically they can't get any they can't do any gas exchange with their gills there. Now, one thing that I do want to highlight here, and I think that at times we have a tendency to think that muskies are really, really fragile, almost like you look at them funny and they keel over. That's actually really not the case, and that was typified, or I should say exemplified, by the Project Noble Beast. We held fish out of water for 90 seconds. And I was telling Pete this yesterday on the phone that when I was chatting with him, but at first I went, 90 seconds kind of sounds long, but like, is it really that long? The reason we did 90 seconds is we actually pulled anglers from this region, including down the St. Lawrence and the Ottawa and the Rideau. And there was a really wide range of air exposure durations that people had said that they exposed their fish to. And this was kind of middle of the road. And this involves like measuring and pictures and video and all that. But when I actually went to hold these fish out that were exposed to this treatment during Project Noble Beast, 90 seconds is a long time. We had someone with a stopwatch. And so I'm just sitting there with the fish, holding on to the fish for 90 seconds. If we just did silence for 90 seconds, it would feel like an eternity. And nevertheless, with the 15 fish that were subjected to that treatment, none of them died. So, they can still withstand some air exposure. We don't know where that threshold is, but definitely, the bottom line is the least amount of air exposure possible is the very best thing we can do for the fish. And this whole movement now is something called the Keep 'em Wet movement of just, really consider not even taking them out of the water and just leaving them in the water and getting creative shots with the fish, just in the water. You got a GoPro under the water, things like that. Something that I really try and preach to anglers is the need to minimize handling at all costs. So there's two ways I think we can do this. We can reasonably expect to make kind of quote unquote gains in terms of minimizing our handling. One of them is to stop over relying on long nose pliers. So instead of the default being reaching for the pliers and then, yanking on it for a while, and then after a while, you're like, I can't get it out with the pliers. Okay, now I'll go to the bolt cutters. Flip that. So I'm guilty of this. I will usually reach for my pliers, but I'm starting to, think that one improvement that I can make as an angler is to maybe take the default to the bolt cutters first, and then, if at all, like if I ever need to use the pliers, maybe it's just to remove a cut hook. After you cut the hook, you don't want to leave it in the fish per se. But the least amount of handling possible relative to unhooking is really good. The other thing to be said too is that fish are not accustomed to being touched. That is not a normal thing for a fish to experience. And so when it comes to actually releasing fish, when I first started muskie fishing back in the early 2000s, people were advocating a lot of like back and forth, move the fish back and forth in the water. And then it went from back and forth to, oh, don't do that. Just go side to side, and it creates a little bit of turbulence around their mouth and it gets the water moving and things like that. I am now of an opinion that you just put that fish back in the water and let it go. Just step back. Take your hands like this after you put it in the water. There's no need to hold on to the fish any longer than you absolutely have to. And to me, absolutely have to is check to make sure it's able to sit upright. And if it's able to sit upright, then you let your hands go. I don't have any issue with you taking a picture of yourself, posing with the fish, and you're looking up at the camera with the fish, hanging in the water like that. That's fine. But don't sit there and move the fish back and forth and side to side and grip onto it for minutes at a time or whatever. Just put it back in the water, let it go, let it swim away from you, and just be as little a disturbance as possible to that fish. In terms of water temps, people have big questions about this. Last summer was really hot pretty much everywhere in North America, particularly within the Muskies range. I'm not going to get into this too much, in part because as a scientist, I want to wait until this current study that's going on right now in Virginia and West Virginia is complete. The jury is still a little bit out on that for sure. I can tell you that from my own research from Project Noble Beast that stress levels got higher as water temperatures warm, particularly when we're talking about fish that were held out of the water. So when we're comparing fish that were held out of the water to fish that were left in the water and not air exposed, fish that were held out of the water tended to have higher stress levels as a result of that. So, what I would say is if you are inclined to continue to fish for muskies during warm water, just try and minimize air exposure and handling time kind of as much as possible. Something else I get sometimes, a question I get sometimes too, are about dangerous baits. And are there any baits out there that have a higher likelihood of inflicting damage on potentially irreversible damage on fish? The short answer is every lure type poses a risk to the fish, period. There are, single barbless hooked baits out there. Those might be the safest. They can be, modified. You can take off treble hooks and put single C-wash hooks on them. Those may be the safest. Certainly, there's lots of literature out there to suggest that that does reduce time to unhook and injury and bleeding. It's not used a lot in muskie fishing, I think, because, and frankly, I don't have any single barbless hooks on my baits, in part because they're hard enough to catch as it is. So I've got a nice pair of Nipex, and if I got problems, I start cutting. I have experienced some deeply hooked fish on rubber baits. I think that those tend to maybe sometimes induce some deeper hooking in fish, in part because of the way the bait works. They shoot forward and then stop, and the fish comes up behind them and overpowers the bait. But that said, you know, they can do the same on bucktails too. I'll show you a photo in a minute of a fish that actually ended up dying on me that was caught on topwater, which is something that I don't typically think of as being, you know, a particularly quote unquote dangerous lure style. I just put a picture up there of a sledge. Local Muskie legend Hedrick Wachelka, he takes the back hook off of his big sized sledges because he had at one time had noticed a lot of fish getting kind of weirdly hooked or dangerously hooked with that back hook slinging really close to, or even sometimes unfortunately into the eye. And so he decided to cut that hook off of those baits in particular, which tend to evoke a pretty savage strike from fish. I think it's really important to remember that no matter what we do, it is very likely that we will end up killing a muskie at some point in our fishing careers if we spend enough time fishing for them. And these are probably going to be fish that would die immediately. The ones that die, you know, 48 hours after release, that may have died as a result of complications from the release and the angling event. Those are fish that we might not necessarily, see. Not every dead fish floats, right? A lot of them will end up sinking to the bottom, but some of them do float. We will see some of those. This is a fish that ended up dying on me. You can see it was a pretty big injury to its mouth. But if I remember correctly, this was back in 2007. It got the topwater lure, and I think the back hook went underneath the gill flap on the right side there, and got it in its gill arch, and it eventually bled out. Which was too bad for that fish. That's, to my knowledge, that's the only one that I've caught that's died, and I don't really know how many fish I've caught, but for sure it's a small fraction of them. I also get questions about why do some fish seem to die. You know, these might be seemingly healthy looking fish, you know, no bleeding, like this fish there that was puffing blood out of its gills. You know, some fish just seem to die, and this could be because of an underlying health issue that we, you know, aren't aware of as anglers, or there could be, you know, fish can have heart attacks too, just like humans. There's something called hyperkalemia, which we started to maybe notice some signs of during Project Noble Beast. So that's this bar there, or this square here. These were fish that were held out of water at higher water temperatures. So these were like, you know, 70 plus degree water temperatures up to, but not exceeding 77 Fahrenheit, I believe. And high potassium, which is what you see on the y-axis there. High potassium is what hyperkalemia is. And that is, you know, that can cause cardiac arrest. And so it's possible that if this level was high enough, we may have experienced some fish that would have died as a result of increased potassium. So what do I see about the future? I sometimes get this question too. What are some things on the horizon that might become some potential issues? Well, first of all, you know, there's more people than ever fishing muskies. You know, we're going to talk about that today with John and Pete. Education is really important. It's partially why I wanted to do this presentation today, because, you know, I want to get this information out there as people are starting to think about muskie fishing this coming season. And for any of you out there that are relatively new to the sport, it's really important that you take fish handling seriously. And if you're, you know, bringing new people into the sport, make sure that one of the first things, you know, you teach them is how to handle fish really well. The other thing that I see as being a potential issue, I'm going to emphasize potential because we don't really know at this point. But people that are starting to target deeper fish, especially during summer. So, you know, you may have kind of two groups of fish during the summer period, some that stay shallow and some that will pull out into deeper water. And it's these ones that pull out into deeper water that people might be targeting in the summer thinking that they might be a little easier to catch because they might be biters as opposed to the fish shallower that are maybe not so much. And I think I've talked about swim bladders before and muskies and barotrauma. And, you know, while muskies do not have the type of swim bladder that like rockfish do in that top right photo there, you can see its eyes bulging out. You know, rockfish get caught from like 300 feet of water routinely. Muskies don't have the kind of swim bladder that something like a rockfish has, and it makes them less susceptible to barotrauma, but the key words there are less susceptible. They can still suffer the effects of barotrauma, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a fish that comes out of deep water. These can be fish that come out of relatively shallow water that for some reason maybe just get some extra air into their swim bladder that they're not able to expel through the pneumatic duct that connects their swim bladder to the esophagus. And so you can get situations where fish, you may see them try to go down and then they pop back up, and then they try and go down and then they pop back up, and they may do that for a while. And those fish may take off on their own at some point, or they may not. They may end up dying because, you know, they're potentially just hanging out at warm water that they weren't at 2 minutes ago when they were down 30 feet in the water column in cool water. And now they're just chilling at the surface in, you know, warm water temperature, and their bodies are not able to adjust to that temperature because they came from fairly deep water. And so I have some potential concerns about that, but, you know, we'll, you know, I think that needs to be explored some more, and I'm not sure, but maybe the study down in Virginia will help us out with that southern muskie study. Something else here that I put up there is a descending device, and I hope Will, if he's watching this, is okay with me sharing that photo down there on the bottom. But it's a type of homemade descending device that Will put together. Basically what it is it's just a weighted piece of wire that sticks on the bottom jaw of the fish, and then it pulls the fish down to a depth. And that weight there is only like 6 to 8 ounces. It doesn't have to be particularly heavy in order to get the fish down. But this is a way that people on the West Coast with rockfish, you can see that device in that fish's mouth there on the top right there. That's a descending device. That's meant to get fish down to 300 feet really quickly. You know, we're not catching muskies out of that kind of water depth, but these kinds of devices might be really important for us to use if people are going to start targeting deeper fish, especially as bondy baits and jigging becomes a more mainstream tactic. So these are some things I think that we need to kind of be aware of and sort of keep our finger on the pulse, so to speak, as we move into the future. As always, if you have any questions, please send them to John or email me directly. You can also get in contact with me on social media, Instagram at Sean Landsman, or Twitter at FishNeedLove2, if any of you are Twitter folks. And yeah, I can be reached either of those places. So thanks.
Fantastic as always, Sean. Wow, I'm feeling terrible because we're going to actually make Pete Maina wait 3 more minutes. I'm going to add a couple of comments. Sorry about that, Pete. I can't believe I'm doing that, but I can't believe you and I are making Pete wait. So just leave it at that, Sean. But some really great comments on handling. One in particular you made. One of my great fishing friends is Kent Rosen. He's a vet. And after watching for a bunch of years, he said, why don't you just take the cutters as your first option for getting hooks out of a fish? And I answered, well, because that's not the way that we've always done it, which is, you know, how your dad answers. But when I went away and thought about it, it's absolutely a better idea. And, you know, you and I have experienced eyes, and we can look at a hook and judge if it's going to be a problem. But, you know, you don't want to go through that exercise with a pair of pliers for 60 seconds and then realize that, wow, now I got to start to work to get in on a tough angle with hook cutters. I think going to hook cutters is something that we should do as a best practice for fish in the future. So really good observations there. Dangerous baits and dangerous hooks. Yeah, you and I are both big Hedrick Wachalka fans. Those back hooks on suics and on sledges, you don't need those most of the year, because 19 out of 20 times in the spring, summer, and early fall, your muskie hits a bait in the head, and in the worst case hits it in the middle of the body. And those back hooks generally only ever get in the way. They don't catch you extra fish until the water starts to get cold in the fall. So, in terms of summer practice and what you can do most of the year, take those big hooks off, take those back hooks off of those big jerk baits. And giant baits catch giant fish, but when small fish eat a 12 or 13 inch trolled crankbait, my first experience with that is I had a 19-inch Yucca wobbler that sat on my wall on my fireplace for a long time. I took it out, I trolled it for 45 seconds, and a 32-inch fish hit this 19-inch bait and grabbed it by the head, and then the bait turned sideways on the fish because a small fish can't control that bait. So, if you're in a fishery that's got a lot of small fish, it's just not a good idea trolling those big baits. Those big baits are meant for catching big fish. And in terms of release tools, that tool that you were showing for taking a fish down to depth as a guide, I purposely don't fish deep all spring, all summer, and all early fall, because we get on a lot of fish, and there's some mortality associated with bringing those fish out of the depth. And there's more and more really cool baits for fishing deeper and deeper. And you and I talked before about what's a maximum depth to take a fish out of, and I think we agreed on 25 to 28 feet. That was kind of our comfort zone, somewhere in there. And in the summer, when the water's really heating up, is that a shallower depth that we want to consider even?
Yeah, possibly in the summer. Yeah, getting up maybe towards like 20 feet as opposed to 25. Yeah.
So that deep water fishing, it's got its time and its place, but you can't, with more people doing it, and with naturally reproducing fishery that we have up here, best practices are really important. So fantastic stuff. A bunch of what you said will lead into our conversation with Mr. Maina. And again, I'm so sorry we made you wait in the background.
Yeah, sorry, Pete.
I got to say a couple things about Pete before we bring him out. Oddly, he's our second guest from Hayward, Wisconsin in the past month. We had Larry Ramsell on here. Wisconsin is the muskie capital of the world, and Hayward apparently is the capital of the muskie capital of the world. So happy to have Pete here from Hayward this evening. The evolution of Pete Maina is just a great story. I love hearing. Pete's done everything. He's been everything, and he keeps evolving. And he comes from a time, I talk about it like the old days, but it's not that long ago that a lot of people were bonking fish on the head. Muskies were getting kept, and so there's been a real evolution, and muskie fishermen have led the way in terms of educating their participants, in terms of looking after their fish and their fisheries better. And we got to keep doing that. And so Pete, as an advocate for this over the years, I've been a huge fan. One of my proudest moments of filming was going 17, 18 years ago, being out in a boat with Pete, and I stood side by side with Pete, and I did a ramble, because we weren't catching fish for a while at that point, about the American musky mullet versus the Canadian, back when I used to have some mullet type hair. And so Pete with the blonde, verbose out there American musky mullet, and I had a more refined, darker Canadian musky mullet. Truly proud for me. Sorry to call it a mullet if that offends you, Pete. It's great hair. Maybe it's more 70s rock and roll hair, and you're still rocking it. So let's bring Pete out. He's more than just good hair.
Wow, that was quite the deal there. I gotta say though, but by the way, I didn't realize I've already done everything. Does that mean I gotta quit? But Sean has tremendous hair. Now, nothing against you, John. It was, the mullet was a little more in, back when we were fishing together.
Back in the day.
I like the look Sean's got going. Yeah,
he's
young.
He's young and cool. he's young and cool, and rock star hair never goes out of style, Pete. So you're still looking good.
No, no.
I got to ask you, how much do you miss Canada?
Tremendously. I gotta be, I guess I don't know how much, any other way to put it. Yeah, there's something about the Canadian Shield and Canada fisheries in general. It's just different, and more part of the experience, frankly, than catching a muskie. To me, the actual enjoyment of the overall experience. It's a special place, without a doubt.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And Canadian Shield fishing, that was where I cut my teeth on muskies up in Menaki, north of Kenora. That is just a special place. You've been fishing up here for a long time. How long have you been fishing in Eastern Canada? When's the first time you came out here?
Oh gosh, I don't remember the exact year, but it would be about 25 years ago. Yeah. That I first started. So
well traveled, and a long time up here. I got to participate in the Hamilton chapter Muskies Canada meeting back about 6 or 8 weeks ago. You were there. I think I left at like the 2.5 hour mark, and everybody was still just wired. So many good questions and such a good talk. But you told your story sort of as an introduction to yourself after Dave Bilal gave you a great introduction. You just told your story of your early muskie years, which involved being a fanatical 2 charter a day guide. One thing that's different between Muskies Canada and Muskies Incorporated is Muskies Incorporated has a point system. And so you can actually achieve the most points and catch the most muskies. And, in a testosterone dominated industry, it's really a lot of guys get totally caught up in that, myself and a lot of other ones as well. You actually climbed to the top of that ladder. That's part of the obsession and just your whole evolution of an obsessive muskie fisherman. Do you want to tell us a bit about that, your early days and how you got to where you are?
Yeah, well, that was something that I didn't talk about as part of my muskie life, I guess, in that other program. I mean, very simply, I was addicted from a little kid growing up on a resort and fishing in general. And my first guide job was at the age of 11, and I started full-time guiding in the summers at the age of 14, and weekends in the fall as well. And it was interesting in those days. Probably the first 3 years, I never even considered not killing every legal muskie that came on my boat as a guide, because that's what I was told I was supposed to do, and that's what I did. And then I finally started thinking for myself, and amazingly, I found out through that experience, and then things just kind of gradually getting better with regard to catch and release and size limits and all of that progression. It was proven, my original thought when somebody brought it up to me that releasing them might be a good idea, that they actually do get bigger as they get older. And that was kind of an enlightening thing. But in my early 20s, I already was actually into my guide career quite heavily and was kind of known as one of the best around the Hayward, Wisconsin area where I live here. And that's when the Muskie Inc. contest thing that you brought up really kind of hit me. And yeah, definitely the ego flames were burning hot. And I decided one year that I thought, well, I bet I know I can catch. I don't know exactly how many I catch, but I catch a lot of them, and I can catch even more if I try hard. So I spent 5 years basically doing that, and finally decided to stop doing that when I realized that I was giving up quite a bit when it came to trophy size fish, because I was kind of obsessed about catching as many as I possibly could. Therefore, I was mainly fishing on smaller fish fisheries. Our particular area here, we've got all kinds of options, lakes, rivers, whatever. And I was purposely targeting higher density fisheries which unfortunately, in all cases, just about translate into not many big ones. So my average size muskie that I caught in those years was probably 34, 35 inches. I did catch a lot of them, though.
And was your fishery a stocked fishery back then? Are most of the fish that you're catching stocked in Wisconsin?
Stocking program in Wisconsin's been going on a long time. I would say that it was about 50-50 in those days. The fisheries that I was on, some were totally natural reproduction. A handful were basically stocking only, and then some were supplemental stockings. But there's, being known as the muskie capital of the world and stuff, it's kind of interesting to look at the history. I don't know if you got into any of that when you had Larry on, but there's a lot of our lakes here that actually where muskies were not indigenous, where they were introduced. We've had several of our real popular muskie fisheries here initially were bass and northern lakes, and both muskie and walleye were introduced. So,
yeah, it's fascinating that you were able to amass the most points fishing in Wisconsin. These days, it would be awfully tough for anybody other than a Lake St. Clair fisherman to win that trophy. I don't know who wins it year after year now in the States, but I guess that's pre the Clair bonanza.
Yeah, I would say that's true. And to be real honest, these days I don't follow it, John. But it's probably almost certainly some anglers that are in some of the stock fisheries areas. You see peaks. That's one thing. You folks in Canada, for the most part, you're dealing with natural reproducing fisheries, so you don't see massive fluctuations in population density, and also just the simple fact that your fish are used to about the same amount of pressure, and they have the same amount of education. The one thing that happens with stock fisheries is, frankly, they're just dumber at first. Even if they start getting a fair amount of pressure, it just seems like the stock fish, at least in the initial years, those first, I don't know, 5 to 6 year classes that get stocked in the body of water, for whatever reason, when they're the new ones, the first time they've been in there, they just, I don't know to what degree, but they seem to be a little stupider, a little easier to fool, which of course is quite desirable. I like that, I gotta say. But that's where most likely people that would be winning any kind of contest like that are, probably taking advantage of those kinds of fisheries.
Yeah, and in Wisconsin now, is trolling legal in Wisconsin now? And it certainly wasn't when you were back when you were winning the Muskies Inc. contest, right? Those would have been all casting fish. Is that right?
Yeah, my fish were basically all casting fish. I didn't like to troll. There's actually several lakes. It's a confusing deal in Wisconsin. The counties all to the east of me in the north were no trolling at all. My county was no trolling at all, but that's not true. There were 5 lakes that you could actually troll on, and then you go to the north of me, the west of me, and the south of me, even back then, and it was legal to troll in those counties, and then all the southern part of Wisconsin as well. So it's always been kind of a confusing thing, but I just never, did a lot of it, period, because I didn't personally prefer it. And it's kind of funny, it goes back to my early years of muskie fishing, and it's funny how you have perceptions. And part of it's the youth and the ego, but earlier on, I thought that all trollers were lazy and fools and blah, blah, blah. And out east in the eastern states mainly, it was basically the exact opposite of Wisconsin. Eastern guys trolled, And I thought they were a bunch of lazy sandwich eaters, you know, and that's all they knew how to do. And then finally I got to the stage where I started doing the trolling quite a bit, and then gained a new respect for it. Obviously, everything's got its time and place, but you know, any fool can throw a lure off the back of the boat, but everything's arguable. But technically, a good technical troller is probably smarter in a lot of ways, and it actually requires more work than a lot of people who haven't done it well and really gone after it would realize.
Yeah, you know, you and I are both casters. I would so much rather catch a fish casting, and my trolling game has really picked up over the years as well. I think I have to admit, if I just trolled, I'd probably catch more fish. Now, they wouldn't be nearly as fun. How about you? How do you see that?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think overall, and obviously this greatly depends on the fishery you're on, but I think overall you might get a little bit larger size class of fish too trolling if you're truly trophy only type of guy. But you know, I don't know exactly how long before we go into the next topic of handling, but it's, you know, just popped into my mind here with talking with, you know, we're talking about the quality of the fisheries and size and stuff and stocking and everything. And it is one thing on the ego topic that I really try and bring up when it comes to handling and fisheries. It's so easy to get on a tremendous fishery and pat yourself on the back and show photos on social media. And it's a lot more fun to just say you're a great angler and really good at it. But the bottom line is all of us, you know, us pro anglers, whatever you want to call us, you're only as good as your fishery you're on, the health of the fishery you're on. So there's a lot of the factors in there, but obviously a huge part of it beyond the stocking is just strictly, you know, how the handling goes and how successful catch and release goes to maintain fisheries that are at a quality level. And I always try and bring that up, that you know, the single most important thing you can do actually to catch more and bigger fish is learn how to be really good at releasing, because that means the fishery is ultimately going to be healthier, and therefore obviously you got a chance to catch one. You can't catch something that isn't there. I realized that years ago in the state of Wisconsin, where you know, we talked about the Muskie zinc thing and the small fish. I didn't catch a 50-incher for years and years and years. I was really good at it. We just didn't have them for the most part. We had a handful of trophy fisheries, but in most cases, our fisheries the fish died before they ever got that big. So there was basically no expectation of even catching a 50-incher, John, for the most part, for, you know, almost the first 2 decades of my career before I started moving around and before some of the lakes in the Hayward area actually got some fish that were allowed to get that big.
That's a really huge conservation point that you mentioned there. The only reason there was no 50s was because of all this fishing pressure and all this handling. The people that bonked them and the people that mishandled them, and you got an awful lot of people that are fishing up there. And so, yeah, the fishery you end up with, Gord Piser's great expression is that you get the fishery that you deserve. And so there's a really direct relationship between how well you handle them and how big they get, you know. And Sean talked earlier about size limits up here in Canada. We have size limits from 36 inches up to 54 inches. And, you know, personally, I don't see the need for lower size limits in this day and age. We've proved, you know, this is not an eating fish. You know, it's like people ask, do you have a standard answer when people ask you, what does a muskie taste like? You get that question?
Yeah, I always tell them they actually suck, which is probably not completely true. When we ate them years ago, they weren't that bad, but it's just, yeah, the bottom line is that cannot be sustained. You know, maybe years and years ago, but it's the lowest density critter in the system, and frankly, for as many of us that are pursuing them these days, there's not even enough for everybody to keep their first one. I mean, it's not a reasonable expectation to maintain fisheries at all. So, in reality, Yeah, I mean, I think higher size limits are the the only thing I would say could possibly be negative, and being perfectly honest about higher size limits is it very seldom, but if you do have one die, it's a shame to have it go to waste. Then again, nature, it's not like it doesn't get used. Birds and turtles and whatever are going to eat it. But otherwise, in reality, for the realities of what we're dealing with these days, the population densities and everything, yeah, they basically should be a no keep fish. You don't even need to put numbers on it. Just no keep, frankly.
Yeah, my answer to and I get the question a few times a year, what does a muskie taste like? And we say, tastes like bald eagle. And people go, oh, they're aghast. And that's right. You shouldn't eat a bald eagle, and you shouldn't eat a muskie either. And a muskie is a lion on the plains of Africa. And there's a lot of antelope and wildebeests and lots of great tasting stuff that's common. This is just not an eater fish. So getting those size limits up is something that I hope we do a better job of in Ontario. And again, if you don't put them back, you don't get to 50s. You talked at the Hamilton meeting, the first time I heard the term COVID pressure. And so what did you mean by COVID pressure, and how did it influence your world last year?
Well, very, very simply, we have a huge amount of people here in the Midwest that travel across the Canadian border every year to enjoy, mainly the Sunset Country area north of Minnesota there, and it's well, we found out last year exactly how much fishing pressure it is, because with the COVID craziness and people with dealing with masks and lockdowns and this, that, and the other, they couldn't wait to get out on the water. So we've got more anglers interested in fishing just to get out and get away from that nutty stuff out on the water, on top of everybody else we had prior. And then all of a sudden you have the Canadian border closed by people who are certainly not willing to give up on fishing for the year. So they were going to go somewhere. In fact, I really have to say that the social media forums were kind of really got to be a nuisance, frankly. And it's not that I don't like dealing with people or talking to people, but it was frankly unbelievable to me, especially early on, how many comments were, I'm flattered that people want to ask me, but it was totally unbelievable how many people were saying, what do I do? Where do I go, Pete? I can't go to Canada. I've done this couple of trips every year. Here's where I go. I'm not that familiar with Wisconsin, Minnesota. What do I do? I mean, it was just really unreal. And frankly, I would have to say in most cases, every place I went, I didn't spend a whole lot of time in Michigan. It was mainly Wisconsin, Minnesota last year, but easily, basically it was about 100% or more direct muskie pressure. I would say that would also be true of other species as well. I probably noticed it the most for muskies, but obviously that's mainly what I target. But that is really significant, especially when it's kind of all at once. And obviously there's more handling issues and potential delayed mortality, and frankly everybody that is remotely honest at all kind of had a tougher year. And it's nothing anybody should beat themselves up over, because the bottom line is you got the X amount of acreage is the same, and you double that pressure when muskies get active, and the anglers are all good these days for the most part. And if somebody catches one before you get to that spot, you're not going to catch them. They're not, they're obviously in most cases going to recuperate and live to be caught again, but they're certainly not going to do it that same day. So overall, it was certainly a tougher situation and a lot of extra pressure.
Yeah, we experienced the same thing up here as well. 50% more fishing licenses sold in Ontario and Quebec, and locals learning about this amazing resource out on their own water. So Yeah, a whole lot of new people. It's funny. We've used the term intelligent pressure. You know, today's angler going out on the water versus a bunch of years ago. You talked in that Hamilton chapter meeting about a bunch of years ago. You'd look at other boats out on the water and go, yeah, well, they don't have much chance of catching a muskie in that boat. You know, even though they're trying. But today, when the boats are leaving the shore, people are armed with the right equipment, the right electronics. They're way more apt to come in contact with those fish, and so a huge amount of increased handling. And you talked about social media handling. How does that cause us all to handle more fish?
Well, that just basically stemmed from, I guess, to a certain extent, the increase in social media activity. Period, and I guess just a combination of that and ego. There seemed like a fair amount of people, and I understand all of this. When you do have some people that aren't completely truthful, and it's nice to see the truth. But basically, what happens is you get the your fish isn't that big kind of thing going on, and somebody shows a picture, and then it's like, well, you didn't, it wasn't that big. You didn't show exactly how big it is. And the advent of in-boat measuring and bump boards has kind of been a gradual thing over the past few years that has now, because of social media, gone beyond just being a tool where people are using it to measure fish, and it's gotten to be a proof deal. And so now there seems to be, even though I felt like starting a couple decades ago we were going in a better direction, less emphasis on exact sizes and water measuring or no measuring at all. That trend actually kind of turned around to, and I think a big part of it has been social media and the shaming of maybe your fish wasn't as big as you say, or God forbid you don't even know exactly how big that fish was because you didn't measure it. It's like, it seemed like people wanted to see which I found an extremely negative trend when I'm seeing 52 3/4 by exact girth as well, down to the fraction of the inch. That's great. And, I don't necessarily say that people shouldn't want to know that or never even consider trying to get a size on their fish. But what it does mean is more handling, absolutely, without a doubt. And then when it got to the point of essentially you had to prove it to everybody, seen a great increase in people actually feeling like they not only had to get the exact measurement, but they had to verify it by both photo and video. So you have a tremendous amount of people literally feeling like they have to show that musky tail on the bump board with the number that you can see, and or video the whole thing. And therefore, obviously that's, what Sean talked about, the very simplistic but extremely important time out of water. They can't breathe in the air. It's just that plain and simple. And then the other big problem, of course, is when it's done in boat. There's a much bigger chance of the fish actually getting away, fighting the process, and then in some cases actually getting loose on the floor of the boat, which is a really bad thing. I think obviously you wouldn't have to talk about that too long. It's fairly obvious. Then you get into slime coat removal and actual potential damage just from the trauma of the banging around. In recent years, I've heard way more. I hate it out on the water, especially when it's not a real windy day or whatever, sounds traveling, and you hear somebody celebrating catching a fish, and unfortunately the next sound you hear 30 seconds or a minute later is kabang, 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 and that's the fish bouncing around the floor of the boat. One good buddy of mine who actually stopped doing it, a younger fellow, he said the only muskie he ever for sure killed, and of course this is by chance type thing, but he lost control of it. It was so violent. He was trying to get it down on the board, and it banged into a console so hard it actually killed it, he said, which was really kind of weird. I've never really heard of anything like that, but I know he wouldn't lie to me. He said the only muskie he knows he actually killed, that's how it happened. And obviously, you know, someone who cares for the fishery, he decided, well, that's probably not a very good thing to do. But I really, that really sums it up with the social media part of it. I really think that a lot of it is feeling the need to prove the size of the fish, and that's not a good thing. That's not a good trend in any way, shape, or form. And certainly, people new to the sport shouldn't feel like they, you know, have to do that. They should feel like they should err on the side of caution, because that's what, you know, those of us who have been doing it for a while are putting that message out there.
Yeah, some really interesting points with social media pressure. You know, the bigger the fish is, the more people want to get that picture of it, the more handling of
Great
that
point.
fish there is. And so, you know, in a way, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. I listened to you talk about this at the Hamilton meeting, and you referenced it again in this about how, you know, 15, 20 years ago, there was a real movement to water releasing fish. There was a floating measuring stick before there was bump boards. That goes back, you know, 20, 25 years. And we were actually, as a group, looking to measure fish in the water more. And then bump boards seem to have made it easier and justified to bring all the fish in the boat. And, you know, that water release, Sean talked about it earlier. I've never heard of the keep them wet movement that he referenced earlier, which is, I guess, you're familiar with that, which is keep them in the water, release them in the water. And so actually, after your talk in Hamilton, I started thinking, you know, you made the point, why do we need, how many 40-inch fish do you need pictures of? And a lot of my experienced guests are really happy to flip fish off. You know, your new guests, you really need those you know, those pictures are very special, and so you want to take them. But, you know, certainly there's a lot more fish that we don't need pictures of, that we could just release in the water at the side of the boat. And so I started thinking about that, and I actually went out and I sourced a release tool. I called my friend Chuck in Florida. In Florida, you actually can't go out on the water unless you have a release tool similar to this, at least 20 inches long, something that you can water release your fish. It's the law in Florida. I don't know if it's the law in any other states, but it's really forward thinking. And in the muskie industry, I used to have a tool. I can't think of the name of it, a grab it. Actually, it was called a grab it a number of years ago, which really helped you get a hold of the hook in the water. And there's a lot of hooks, you know, a lot of fish that are hooked that you can just grab that one hook and flip it off and not even have to bring it in the net. So this is a tool that we're carrying here at Muskie Factory Baits because of what you said, and because initiating that practice of more water releases, it's, you know, just something we have to do with more intelligent fishermen, putting more pressure and handling more fish for our naturally reproducing fisheries. It's just a necessary step. And so, you know, the water releases, you and I were talking earlier today about that measuring pole. You know, that was a staple for us in the water a few years ago. For you as well?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. When I measured, you know, I got to the point where I just quit doing it. And then, you know, I was lucky. Most of my clients didn't really care, and they knew I could estimate real close, and they're happy enough with that. And I want to emphasize here that, you know, I can forget to do this. You know, people who want to get measurements and weights or whatever, that, you know, they're not bad people. So don't, you know, and I don't hate all bump boards, and I don't hate bump board manufacturers, and, you know, but it's just a matter of getting the message out that we should be doing it the safest way we possibly can with regard to what's important to the anglers, and other considerations, obviously, like hot water and longer fight times. People need to be aware that, you know, that obviously sometimes they don't fight that hard, and then you get a crazy one that, you know, if you know the fish has really stressed itself out right from the start, that ought to register in the brain, just like Sean was talking about with the you know, going to the hook cutters before immediately starting with the pliers and then finding out later. I always try and analyze that. I feel I'm fairly good at that. If I can get it out with a quick pop of the pliers or a tool like you're talking about, that's what I grab first. But if I see really bad in the corner of the mouth or anywhere near the gills or the eyes or whatever, it's immediate hook cutters, not the pliers. So, you know, those kinds of things that we can do. And then if you feel like you really want to get a more precise measurement, gosh, there's better ways to do it. In reality, there's the floating ruler. Weight, in a lot of cases, people started all of this precise measuring to find out what the fish weighed so they could plug it into the formula. They get the length and girth times girth divided by 800, and they know how big, and they say, oh, this fish weighed, you know, how many pounds because of that. Well, if that's the goal, and frankly, weight, then everything's arguable, but, you know, to me, it's a little more important. I'd rather catch a fat 49 any day than a skinny 53, to be real honest with you. You know, I've got buddies that stand on the scale. You know, and as long as you're honest about that, you weigh yourself with the amount of clothes and shoes you have on, you stand on the scale, you grab the fish out of the net, you take your pictures while standing on the scale, you do some math. That's as accurate as it could possibly get. Your scale doesn't have to even be dialed in accurate as long as you weigh yourself with the amount of clothes you got on, and then, you know, do the math after you know, I actually hadn't done anything like that, but a buddy of mine had, and we did it last fall. It actually works pretty slick, doesn't take much time. You could weigh fish right in the net and do math, or move them to a cradle and weigh them. In Europe, they've got weigh slings specifically designed for that kind of thing with carp and pike and stuff like that, where you could get exact weights that would be way more accurate than doing the formula. And one thing working on that unfortunately is a little delayed, but if people want to do the water measurement, you know, some kind of a stick, a telescoping stick with a bumper on it, so then it would be a little bit more accurate for people who really wanted to be, you know, very accurate, I guess. But bump boards can be used in the water. Obviously, they don't need to be used on the bottom of a boat. So there, you know, there's a lot of different options there that, you know, potentially would be healthier for the fish. At least if it's over the side of the boat, you may have a little more stressful. The fish might fight it, and the fish is therefore in captivity longer. But it's way better than banging around in the bottom of a boat. I mean, you know, even if there's a little extra handling time and a little extra stress there, it's certainly not going to be the physical trauma from pounding around in a dry boat. And you know, that there's no way that should really, that's maybe the biggest message I would have, is to try and avoid that as much as possible. And it's definitely more prevalent. I just see it happen more on the water now than I did, you know, 15 years ago.
Yeah, that's probably a great message to get across, and something that we should all be thinking about for the future. Keep them wet, do more work in the water, find ways to do that. We've got some photos here of petechial hemorrhaging. These are photos that you sent over to us, and you've got some information on research on petechial hemorrhaging. So Mike, if you want to throw these up, and Pete, why don't you tell us what petechial hemorrhaging is and why it's a concern if you're an angler? We see photos like this all the time on the internet. What does that mean?
And I would point out that I've seen a lot more of it in recent years. So essentially that means, you know, increased stress. And you know, somebody like Sean would be, you know, more qualified to explain, you know, exactly the how and the why, what causes it. But very simply, I found as my personal fishing and guiding, I found it as kind of my own gauge as to when, even though I would sense it, I was, able to use that as a gauge, seeing that hemorrhaging, which would generally start in the tail of the fish, not the actual tail itself, in the skin, just up from the tail. It's easier to see it in the spotted strains, the Great Lake strain and the Leech Lake strain, but you can actually see it on other strains of fish as well. And when I became very aware of the issue, and I actually, I had some fish die, but I had a distinct case that really got me worried and thinking when I had delayed mortality for the first time. Essentially, we released the fish. I was guiding people, and we released the fish. It did not release well. But it did go down and stay down. Well, anyway, I guided the next day in the same body of water. Wasn't very windy. I know for sure it was the same fish we released that died and floated up. Sean talked earlier about they don't all float. So, when we're having delayed mortality, there's certainly more of that out there than we realize, which scares me even more. You don't know, I was just telling myself, well, you don't really know what you're doing here. You may actually be losing more fish than you realize. Well, I was paying more attention than ever because of that. And the one thing that I just learned from trial and error, when I had muskies that released poorly, there was usually explanation for it. It was longer fight times or something like that, warmer water, combinations of those things. Maybe it was hooked bad. Maybe it got, dropped by the angler I was guiding or whatever it might be. But I learned just through observation that was a bad thing to see, hemorrhaging starting at the tail. And now guys that have more experience with it, a good buddy of mine, Tom Peniston, I did some video pieces on my YouTube channel with him. He's had fishery hatcheries experiences in a lot of different things as a biologist, and he's one that really pays attention to that too, and basically says that when the whole fish gets red throughout the body and then into the fins, at least his opinion, in most cases, that's a real prime candidate for delayed mortality. So I guess without any further babbling, what I do know from my own personal experience, and I believe can be backed up by some guys like Tom and Sean, seeing that hemorrhaging starting, that should be an all points bulletin to individuals. That's why I want to get it out there, that when you see that start, if your normal process is measuring or more photos or whatever you haven't gotten done yet, that thought should be over. You should now, if you care about the good of the fish, it's time to get that fish back in the water, and obviously somebody can probably still get a release photo or whatever. But if you care about the good of that fish, once that hemorrhaging starts showing up, all handling should be over.
Really great point to get across to everybody. And just in case we weren't clear enough, that petechial hemorrhaging in particular is the red rash type blood that we see on the sides of the fish. For me, that's like a level 3 stressor. First level of stress is that you get blood in the fins and blood in the tail. And that's just, it's like somebody running 100 meters, the blood goes to your legs. Level 2 of stress would be now you can actually see blood dripping out of the fins or the tail, or you could grab a fin or the tail and run your finger along it and blood would come out. And that's a more serious level of stress that you got to think about whether or not you want to handle that fish. This petechial hemorrhaging, this is like a level 3. This is really serious. And as Pete said, this is you probably don't want to take a picture with this fish. Your handling regimen, when you see that, as somebody who cares about the fish, is over. So, taking that picture, not advisable. More handling, not advisable. This is as severe a sign of stress on a fish that the fish can show you. You know, the next two things would be a fish when you put it in the water that can't keep its balance, can't stay upright, and again, that's a fish that's that's in severe stress. You know, may come back, and an inability to focus the eyes. Again, a fish that are in trouble. You know, all of those last three signs, probably not, you know, something that means your fish is just in release mode at that. So yeah, thanks for sharing that, Pete. We all see fish, you know, occasionally with the petechial hemorrhaging, and you know, we know more about it now, and it means don't handle the fish anymore. This wasn't supposed to be a show all about conservation, because you're one of the greatest muskie catchers of all time, but you know, the handling is more and more important, especially with the pressure issues that we've talked about. Let's talk about catching muskies for a little while. And I'll bring up a couple things that I learned from watching you fish, and maybe you can comment on those. In sharing a boat with you, I watched you throw a crankbait out on the St. Lawrence, which, you know, something from your area. We talked about it with Jim Sarek a few weeks ago. Throwing crankbaits is a really common practice for you guys. It's never been a traditional Eastern method of fishing. And so, you know, the crankbait, this is going back 17, 18 years, was a little different for me, but I'd never seen anybody work a bait as erratically as you did at that point. I was fishing with, I think, a double D or a triple D, but man, you were just ripping and tugging on that thing like I'd never seen, you know, with good lengthy pauses. Talk about that erratic action and how big a part of that is for your fishing.
Yeah, I will say, in reality, of course, it's a horrible thing to hear as a muskie guy. But if somebody did say, and I get the question a lot, well, if you could only have one lure, what would it be? It'd definitely be a crankbait. I think they're the most versatile bait year round. You know, if you had to include the whole season, cold water, warm water, the whole 9 yards. Obviously, you control them too, so that helps quite a bit as well. But there's just so many different things you can do with them. And that's what makes them so versatile. And obviously one of the natural instincts of you know, muskies have got it made pretty well, you know, and I guess until we come along and fool one and embarrass it and whatever, they've only got one job in life, and that's to eat. And of course, the easier the better. So, you know, the predator instinct, if you can make something look wounded and easier to grab than what they're used to having to grab in the real world for them, you know, that's really what makes it successful, that erratic action. So when times are tough, and frankly, obviously I was doing that when things are a little tougher. That's one of those things that you can do. Why bother with it? Because frankly, it's not as efficient as something like a bucktail or some straight retrieve baits that'll be a little bit easier on you. and if the muskies are in the mood to bite them, you know, that's what you want to do. It's all a matter of efficiency. I think in a lot of cases, muskie people don't talk efficiency enough to a certain extent. But to me, that crankbaiting, you know, with those real erratic pauses and purposeful weed contact and that kind of thing, with a lot of extended pauses, that is part of the patterning process, and that is something that will work when it is a real tough bite. You know, for your more standard baits, straight retrieve baits, and I, you know, I'm sure I was doing it there that day, but you know, it's not real easy on your back. But if you can just purposely get in weeds and rip them, which, you know, these super braids these days allow you to do that. Sometimes it's the actual weed contact as well that's needed, or rock contact. I find it's actually more effective in the weeds. I think the fish are negative. They're really hunkering down in there, and they just tend to not really want to bother coming up to grab anything. But when you make the weed contact, literally bust the weed by snapping the rod with the super braid line, and then you throw that pause in there, especially if it happens a couple of times, busting a few weeds right in front of that fish. you can definitely get some reaction strikes that other anglers just aren't going to get otherwise.
That's a really good learning point for us out here in the East. When we surveyed our audience, it was really interesting to hear how many people we did have, from Wisconsin, from all over the U.S., and that regional knowledge still exists. So, to hear Pete get on and tell you that a crankbait is, if you only had one bait, that wouldn't be the answer of somebody out here in the East. I think Jim Sarek said the same thing a few weeks ago. You talked about ripping it into the weeds and into the bottom. Those are tactics that we just never got on out here in the East, and they're staples in your repertoire at home. And did you say that that's a staple for more pressured fish for you? Is that something you'd use on a higher pressure fishery?
Yeah, but just a tough bite. That's not something I'll go to right away, John. I mean, obviously you're way better off with covering more water. It could be a real effective tool as a swim bait these days. There's way more options than that. You can reel them fast like a bucktail, so you're being very efficient. You're covering a lot of water. Your hooking percentages are still good. And I'm sure you've had other people talk about that kind of stuff. But the one thing, to a certain extent, I'm a fossil. I've been doing it a long time, and I'm a Flintstone. I'm not a super techie guy, but one of the things that I'm really, really good at that I believe I've done well for years and still concentrate on and constantly kick myself in my own hinder to be aware of it at all times is patterning and being efficient. There's only going to be so many windows. The guy who takes advantage of the window, let's be honest, some of us, you get fish outside of windows. That's part of what we're talking about by that crankbait activity and the pauses and the weed contact. That's how you nail a fish outside of a window. But at the end of the day, to a certain extent, you're waiting on the fish to be in the right mood. And the people who learn to take the best advantage of that, and those of us who know that there's no time to celebrate when you catch one during the window, you better be back at it as fast as you possibly can, because that next 10 minutes is precious. And that's where, I'll definitely start out with, if I think it's good weather conditions or whatever. Let's say I was fishing alone. Obviously, when you got multiple anglers, you got a huge advantage. You should have your most efficient baits, best hooking baits in front of the boat, whatever you think is going to work best at the time, that should be there, and the people in the back should be experimenting. But if you're fishing alone, you go with the high percentage baits, best water coverage, best hooking percentages, best holding percentages, and then you basically work out from there, because it's definitely just a big game of how many opportunities you're going to get, and totally taking advantage of them is huge. And then having a good repertoire of different things, like smashing that crankbait to try. Obviously some of the same things can be done with a variety of lures, dive and rise jerk baits, the swim baits I talked about, purposeful contact. Those things can be done with a lot of different lure types, even diving crankbaits. Something that's pretty amazing if folks haven't done it. And again, it's good to have a young back. It can be quite a bit more work, but you can really control deep diving crankbaits at different depth levels, if all by how hard you're twitching that bait, using that super braid line and literally turning that bait into, rather than going down as you twitch it with a softer twitch because it's got that deep lip, when you go beyond the gray line of ripping it even harder with a snap twitch, all of a sudden that bait is now, even though it's technically a deep diver, it's a glider. It's literally going side to side because of the snap that you're imparting on the lure. So one thing I really stress with people, and I talk about quite a bit, is to just, rather than buying the new secret lure or whatever and rushing out and fishing with it, if you get an opportunity, at least with some of your favorite baits that you're going to fish a lot, get in some calm, clear water and learn what you can do with that thing, and certainly practice on the figure eights as well. Every lure is a little different in how it handles at the side of the boat. It's extremely important to be well practiced, not, be surprised. Too many people start practicing when they see that muskie come in, and then next thing you know, they're not doing a good figure eight. They're not cutting the corner right, or they're blowing the lure out of the water because they didn't practice. All of those different things. And then also what you can do in that clear water when it's calm is try and, see where the bait, things that make the bait look the best. But then you should also be thinking, okay, well, I've got my polarized glasses, and in a situation where you see the muskie following your lure, which they have a huge propensity to do, you should be thinking about what in the heck you're going to do if one's following. And a lot of people don't do that. They have no plan at all, especially if they snap on a jerk bait or a glide bait or something. You might not even be right. The only one who knows what's right is the muskie itself and how they're going to react. But you may not have the right move, which could be a total variety of things, from speeding up to slow twitches, pauses, whatever. But so many people get caught flat-footed when they've got that follow, and they have no clue what they're going to do to trigger the fish. At least have a plan, know what the lure does, and have something in mind to, at the very least, play keep away with that fish and try and get them to trigger.
Yeah, you stated that in that Hamilton meeting really succinctly. I asked my guests questions to try to get them to think in advance, and you just said it. What is your plan when a fish shows up at the side of the boat? And you fish all day for that to happen twice, and that's your opportunity. So without that plan, wow, big trouble. When I first fished with you, you did something that's very logical, but I never saw anybody do before. And we were traveling along with the fish finder, and every time you saw a fish on the bottom, you got really excited and you grabbed a rod with a fuzzy does it on it, and you immediately dropped that rod down right away and presented to that fish, which seems so logical because there's a muskie and you put a lure at it. But a lot of us muskie people don't do that. You're casting in at the weeds. And so do you still use jigs a lot? Is that a big part of what you do? Do you try to present to all those fish that you see like that?
Oh, essentially, yeah. I use everything and drive myself nuts thinking about it at times. That's part of the game of muskie fishing. But yeah, there's having a variety of, and things have expanded. When you and I fish, fuzzy does-its I still use, still one of my favorites, but there's so many more options now to fish vertically. I mean, there's the weighted soft plastics. Just think about the number of weighted soft plastics alone. That can be extremely effective, and vertical jigging in a way is basically the same thing as figure eighting, and they will hit those type of presentations as well, instead of just the standard 8 or circle. It's always that's one thing that's always a good idea to, obviously you want to stay out of the way of the other angler, but for somebody else in the boat besides the person that raised the fish, if nothing's working, obviously in a lot of cases somebody does a good figure 8 and they'll trigger the fish right away on the first or second turn. But if the fish is hanging around and nothing's going on, another angler with a vertical presentation a lot of times can draw them over. I've seen that go quite a few times. It's pretty interesting, and it you really want to keep an open mind about things that you can do to trigger fish and things that are different. That's probably the single biggest thing with the pressured fish these days is racking your brain to be showing them something a little different that they haven't seen, and that includes the boat side stuff as well.
On the subject of soft plastics, I read something, I think it was last year, that you wrote. As guides, we have the privilege of getting to fish it used to be more of a privilege. Sometimes it's work these days, but we get to fish with our guests a lot. And so you put your guests in the front of the boat throwing a structure and a baits, and you're in the back of the boat. And so in this article, you were talking about how you're throwing a soft plastic out with a gentle retrieve. Now, who catches more fish? The person in the front of the boat or the person in the back of the boat?
Boy, that's all. It can be drastically different. On tough days, usually the person in the back of the boat. Quite simply, when a window is open, usually, especially if it's a bucktail bite, unless you got a putz in the front of the boat, he's going to clean up, and it's going to be pretty lonely in the back. In a lot of cases, they'll hit the first thing through. But the experimenter in the back of the boat throwing something off the wall on those tough days, and you really don't know. A lot of this is theory and speculation, but to a certain extent on the tough days, possibly the guy in the back of the boat is benefiting from the efforts of the two in front. Maybe they're moving even though you don't see it happen, they're creating awareness, obviously, maybe moving that fish just a little bit up, and he's looking around, and now all of a sudden here comes something totally different, especially if they haven't seen it for a while. It's a different angle, different depth, and their curiosity has been aroused. They're not super active, but they've been aroused that something's wrong, and then lo and behold, here's the fat thing they haven't seen, and by God, it's moving pretty slow, and there it is right in front of my face, and away you go.
Yeah, you answered that really well. It's funny because you see guests, and there's some guests who, they're hell bent on being the one in the front of the boat and having their lure land farthest in front of the boat first all the time. But probably it evens out in the long run because the fish are not active as much or way more than they're active. So being that third rod through, letting the fish get woken up, getting alerted to some baits moving through the first time, that third guy in the boat is often the one who cleans up. So whereas a lot of people think they got to be in the front, that's not always it with the muskies. It just depends on the day out there.
Oh.
You talked about swim baits being in your arsenal these days. High speed retrieve on swim baits. Is that something that you like to do?
Oh, absolutely. And that's just part of the patterning process. So obviously you can go the exact opposite of that and something in between. That's to me, that's one thing I see right away with anglers. And for the most part, I mainly fish with anglers that have done a fair amount of it, but some are not real experimental, and they'll try a lure and they'll just try it the one way, whatever it might be, how they like to do it, and then they move on to the next thing. You never know. And one thing is just flat burning, though. That goes with a lot of things. Some topwater lures obviously don't work real well that way, but when it comes to a bucktail, and frankly, I like at this stage. My ego is softened a little bit. I actually enjoy fishing with the young guys and letting them do that kind of stuff, and I'll be glad to net the fish. Let them crank a million miles an hour. But it's good to have, somebody that can really move a big bucktail. A small bucktail too. Obviously, it doesn't have to be a big bait, but boy, moving real fast, even with big baits. There's something about that. It is a poop or get off the pot kind of situation that I think does really work at times. And then, but if you're unwilling, if that's, you've had some success, let's say, doing that, ripping a swim bait real fast, but if that's the only thing you try, there's going to be days where working that swim bait more like a jig and actually letting it drop down into structure once in a while, maybe sit on the bottom for a split second even, that might be the deal. And you should try it. I think that is, and I catch myself doing that as well. That's where I kick myself in my butt again. But I'm pretty good at kicking my own hinder when I catch myself kind of getting into that rut and just doing the same old crap too. But that's something you should really be aware of, is that, on those tough days, a big difference, to me, to a certain extent, anybody can catch them when the window's turned on and things are right, and you got a brain in your head and can fish a good spot. But it's those real tough days when you pop only one or two fish, that to me is a little more rewarding in a way. It's fun as heck to fish those days when they're really active and you get several windows and you get multiple fish. But sometimes those tough days where you eat, maybe just one out, but it's you worked for it and you did something a little unique and different to make it happen. That's kind of cool.
Fantastic. You like to fish topwater baits in open water, which is way different than most musky anglers. Do you find yourself fishing open water more these days? And talk about fishing the top of the column. Talk about fishing topwaters out in open water, deeper water.
Yeah, I fish open water a lot. And it's certainly not the pioneering thing it used to be. There was a time hardly anybody did it. So those fish, unfortunately, I believe the open water fish actually learn maybe a little quicker than the structure fish. Looking at frankly, the presentations are just right there. There's no cover in the way, and it's a little harder to surprise them with just speed and stuff like that. But topwater is still one of the few things that not a whole lot of people are willing to do out in open water. It's interesting. I found early on that I really didn't need to go down deep. I initially, when I started doing it, I was always thinking deeper. And you had to go deep because you're in deep water. But we've got a lake up in my area here called Whitefish Lake, and it's not a very big lake, but it's 110, 112 feet. And that was kind of the place I had my big revelation years ago when I caught fish in the top 5 feet of the water column in 110 feet of water. And it actually happened first with a bucktail, but then I started throwing topwater as well, and I got to where I was trolling crankbaits right down the middle of the lake at times where I didn't have a single lure running any deeper than 8 feet, and obviously, especially at that time, that was a real unique thing to be doing, and it's interesting. It was good to hear Sean talk about the open water, deeper water, the barotrauma that you guys were discussing earlier as well. It's interesting. I went through a transition, John, where and actually I would give credit to Tom Gelb for this. Unfortunately, Tom passed away recently. The unbelievable angler that probably didn't get enough credit for his pioneering efforts. I'm certainly not laying any blame on him. I mean, the guy's brilliant to figure some of this stuff out before most people ever did. But he was the one that kind of got me tuned into looking near the thermocline in our deeper lakes that stratify around here. I hadn't done a whole lot of that myself, but I did go through a transition after I started fishing the open water fish and even figuring out that some were shallower. That's generally earlier in the season. But I did get to a point where I was trolling mainly in the top of the thermocline and even the bottom of the thermocline. But then I saw what we were talking about earlier. I had issues with the fish dying, and I had issues with the hemorrhaging. And so that turned into a program that actually worked. Tom brought the knowledge forth way before people even talked about it, that they would they would do that and relate to that in the summer months. And I did use it to get on a pattern. It was definitely there. But then in the end, I had to quit doing it because I felt like I was hurting fish, and I haven't done it in a long time. And I would agree that, you guys were talking earlier, if you are targeting, especially summer fish, hotter water fish out in that open water, you definitely do not want to be going deep for them and really targeting those deep fish. Frankly, if you care about the fishery, those fish are just to be left alone. You don't really want to catch those fish because there's a really good chance, even if you don't go through the photos and measuring or any of that, just the experience of getting brought up that far in the water column to that hotter water is really not a good thing.
Yeah, Elmer Hayob, who is a biologist who looked after the Ohio musky fisheries. When I used to go and talk in Ohio, he would always come and prod me before the show and tell them about catching fish on the thermoclines in the summer, and that was a really bad deal for him in Ohio as well. Sound has been an important consideration for you, and it is these days in terms of your fishing. How has your view of sound changed over the years? How do you think of sound in terms of presentations for fish now?
Well, it's basically just an extra edge. You're always looking for the something, right? We've been talking about triggering pressured fish quite a bit, and I do know, my first lessons in sound was topwater lure, no doubt about it, and a long time ago. And very simply, you can have 3 or 4 of the same lure, and one catches all the fish. And when they're painted the same. And obviously, it just makes sense to pay attention to that with topwater in general, more so than other lures. That's really how I learned that, boy, the way this particular one plops has got to be a really important deal. So they definitely hear it, and they definitely have sounds that they prefer. You learn that there. And now you get in, you've got the bucktails behind you there. I mean, obviously blades. There's rattles. There's so many different ways to produce sounds, and I've really gotten into it, I guess, the last several years in working with Livingston Lures, because they have biologically recorded fish sounds that are actually in every lure with a battery and a speaker system. So there's distressed, biologically recorded bait fish sounds of perch, cisco, whatever the case may be, depending on the color of lure that you buy. And they're intermittent sounds. So in the actual lures. And then they've got other sound maker attractor devices that you can either drop over the side of the boat or have inline, which again are the biologically recorded fish sounds. So I know from some of the callers, I literally drop them down through the ice, and the inline ones that you can put on the line. I've literally seen fish come on the electronics to that. I would stress to people, though, that I still don't know, and I'll probably never know for sure that I caught a fish because of it. I honestly can't say that I know I got a bite because of it, because for years I've been catching fish on lures that technically had no biological fish sounds. So, is it the action? You don't really know the action mainly or whatever, but I think that there's no doubt if you could only predict what particular vibrations, let's say for bucktails, fish are in the mood for on a given day. Sometimes we get all these fancy combinations. I'm sure you know this, being a bucktail guy yourself. You get different combinations of vibrations and blade types and this, that, and the other. And sometimes you forget about the old single French blade. Maybe they're in the mood for that, and there's certainly days like that, right? Or just a single Indiana blade that they're in the mood for. They definitely use it to target their forage. And Sean knows more, I'm sure, about the technicalities of it, but the intriguing thing about it is that there's so much in technology now, and just the detailed charts and all of the stuff that's there, where to a certain extent I get, as a somewhat of an old timer, I kind of get like, man, it's not even fair anymore. There's so many advantages. You can see fish off to the side. You got, the big thing the last couple of years is guys that are literally go out and casting for open water fish that are using Panoptics and different devices, and they're literally not casting until they see a fish to cast to. And to me, that's like, oh my God, that's so unfair. But those things still don't make them bite. And that's what's intriguing about the whole sound thing. I know it works. I know it matters. Common sense tells me at times on a tough bite that I feel like I've caught fish because of it, but I really don't know. And the one thing that intrigues me about the Livingston lures is on pauses. It just makes sense that it's got to make a difference. You see those days where the fish are really hitting on the pause. I at least like to think that I've accomplished something with the sound in that case, because when you kill a bait, and it's depending on it's neutral or a sinker or a floater, obviously, but it's basically not doing a whole lot, but it's still making a noise like it's a live thing. I would at least think that it has gotta help, and I can certainly feel like I say it's an advantage, I would think, for following muskies as well.
Yeah, Dr. Bruce Tufts out of Queen's University says sound is the next dimension in fishing for us to really get familiar with. And being musky guys, we're the last adapters of anything new. So it's neat to hear about the new science in the Livingston lures. And something that we should go to. There was a really good question up a couple moments ago from Rob Dykins asking you about waves and fishing your top water baits out in open water. Do big waves discourage you from fishing a top water? What level of turbulence do you change from a top water to a subsurface bait?
Well, again, the only rules are that the fish make them, so it's somewhat of a trial and error deal. But in general, and that's been pretty effective for me over the years. Waves don't scare me at all. I've had muskies hit top water and 6-foot rollers. That for sure you shouldn't discount it. Very, very generally, I'll usually the bigger the waves or the disturbances, the louder the sound is a good general rule I've lived by. So if I'm really, one of the best rough water top waters are tail baits. Obviously, that's probably the biggest group of top water lures there are out there. Obviously, the Joe's Depth Raider to the million other things that are out there now. The original in our area, the Gooch's Tallywhacker was one of the first ones that was kind of a copy on the Mud Puppy. But those baits, bigger tail baits, work great. They ride the waves pretty well, and generally the bigger the better, the louder the sound for the big waves. As I go calmer, I'll go with possibly quieter. Oh gosh, I don't know how to turn this down. Apologize for that. That's John Gillespie actually calling me probably to report on his fishing day when he was filming and not realizing that I'm doing this event with you right now, John. But calmer water, generally quieter tail baits or quieter buzzer type baits, or the real slow moving hog wobbler type. Livingston Lures has got one called the Walking Boss 2. That's been a real favorite of mine in recent years. It's got that slow, enticing wiggle wobble. Obviously, John does not want to take no for an answer here.
Bring him on the show.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what my wife said.
Neat to hear about the topwaters, and I'll just second that. Most musky anglers are afraid to throw topwater baits in waves. They think it has to be a calm, and that's when their baits are going to do the best. And Americans are much better at throwing, or much more willing to throw topwater baits in waves and even big waves. And, you know, it's a good technique. It's just something that we don't do, enough of up here. You know, we've gone almost 2 hours right now, and I could sit and talk for 2 more hours about muskies with you, Pete, but I think you got to have a conversation with John Gillespie in a minute or two. And so maybe it's a good time to
I
just
actually
say,
have some venison.
say again.
I have some venison sitting here too. Venison, you know, it used to be running around deer that I shot. I plan on eating here shortly as well.
All right. Well, we're keeping you from dinner, and John Gillespie's waiting. So I am very grateful for your time and for all the wisdom that you've shared on people today. Thanks for being a leader in promoting fish handling. Years before it was a cool thing to do, and the fact that you're still there and out in front of this, and I admire your musky lifestyle. It makes mine seem more acceptable. You know, congrats on all your success. But we'll give your couple of books a plug. Muskies Suck and Muskies Still Suck. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah. That's one of my proudest moments, John, that I came up with that, frankly. It still rings true these days. Muskies suck. No doubt.
Words to live by. I love the photo on the first album. Again, thanks for being Pete Maina. Thanks for being here, and we'll talk to you again before too long. All the best, Pete.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate it, John. Thank you, and you know, thanks for the reporting that you do on everything. It's great that you're getting Sean on to talk about these topics as well. I appreciate all of that, and yeah, if people want to check me out at all, get the social media stuff and all that, just peteMaina.com is my website. That's a good general place to stop and find everything I'm involved with. So.
Yeah, and if
Thanks
you Google
again.
Pete Maina, you'll be busy for days looking at the results there. Been around for a while. So thanks again, Pete. Fantastic. To the people that are out there, join us again next week. Jason Quintano is our guest. Everything you wanted to know about trolling from the most technical troller out there. Muskie Monday seminar series, week 12. That's a wrap, Mike. You did awesome back there. We'll let you run the controls again another week, Mike. All the best. Take care, everybody. And this is where you just fade me out, Mike.